of webinars that the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives has organized. It sort of gives me great pleasure, and it's a privilege to, on behalf of the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives, I'm a trustee there, and we have two of our colleagues also on the platform at this point of time, which is Mr. O.P. Tandon and Reborn Banerjee Dhar. They have been actually the core of this. They are the nodal people who actually get things going. I'm just there for a little bit of cosmetics here and there. Let me, before I get into the program itself, let me just give you a little outline about the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives. It's a non-profit organization which was founded in 2009. The whole focus of this foundation is to study China, and with a special emphasis on Tibet. There is a very intensive research that goes on different aspects of Tibet. We study the ecology, the culture, the people, the demography, the military aspects of what is happening in Tibet, political aspects, the religious, and sort of everything that you can think of, conceive of on Tibet. This foundation does with tremendous amount of skill and a great reservoir of intellect as well as knowledge and wisdom that comes through to them from some very interesting sources, which are not available in the public domain, but they're open information. So we put these things together, we analyze, we bring out reports, we bring out papers, and we try and give a perspective to what is happening in Tibet and how we, at least as a small organization, look in terms of the future of Tibet. There are some landmark papers that we had given, and they have been very well received in government as well as in other decision-making bodies. I could just name a few. One was some on the water situation. Tibet, as you know, is the water tower of Asia. Feeds water is fed into rivers right across Southeast Asia and India, and goes down into the lower riparians in Bangladesh, etc. We brought this out in 2011. We did a study on transboundary rivers. That was again a very, very well received paper in the community, in the strategic community, as well as in the people dealing with water resources. We have also had a very vital paper. In fact, I would call the paper vital because it was about the reappraisal of India's Tibet policy, which came out in 2013. We are in the process of now looking at it all over again, revisiting it in the current context where things are changing very rapidly, and a new kind of paradigm is evolving in that region. So we are now looking at the possibility of re-looking at the policy on Tibet from India's point of view. We have done some of the things that we have done, which are pretty unique, is to be able to bring in people from India, from Tibet, and from China to sit in the same room in some closed-door sessions and talk about such issues, about power, about the development of the Yarlung Sampo, and some other issues that are quite germane to India's interest. We're doing this because we do believe that Tibet is a vital national security interest as far as India is concerned. You may say whatever, but that's the fact. And I think what the Chinese have done in Eastern Ladakh, and I think will continue to do so over a period of time, it makes us even more determined to study and makes it more vital for us to study Tibet. Let me go straight into what we are meeting here today for. Giving a little background, sir, especially for you who may not have been here for the first three seminars. We talked about, the first one was China's expansionist policies. We brought in experts from dealing with Xinjiang, we brought an expert dealing with Tibet, we brought them from different areas, and we deliberately left out Hong Kong and Taiwan for a later date because I think those are subjects that we need to look at later. Just seeing how China is expanding, especially into regions which it is annexing over a period of time, and we touched upon these two subjects in great detail. The second one was more about Tibet, what it is today, contemporary Tibet. What are we seeing there? We looked at a complete range of issues that are affecting the common people in Tibet today from different angles. The third one was on the international status of Tibet and support that's getting for the freedom of Tibet. The fourth one today, sir, we are doing, which is the reforming the status of Tibet. reaffirming the status of Tibet, where I think one couldn't have got better experts in the field than what we have today. And Kosa, Ambassador Sybil would be chairing this. I don't think I need to really introduce him. He's respected intellect. I think he's if I may say so, not only very knowledgeable, but respected, but feared also for his very candid and no-nonsense views on the way India should be looking at its security. So we are very privileged, sir, and thank you so much for giving us your time, sitting in London to be able to talk to us today and actually chair this session. We have three, I think, absolute topmost experts in this area. Dr. Michael Van Wert doesn't need any kind of introduction. He is, as we all know, been an advisor to His Highness Dalai Lama and the Holiness of Dalai Lama, and as well as he's been a great advisor to the Tibetan government in exile. Absolute authority on law, on the status of Tibet. He would be speaking to us about Tibet's past and present status. Why is it important today? Next speaker we will have is Kelsang Gyaltsen. He's the former special representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Europe. He would be speaking on Sino-Tibet dialogue, the way forward, and India's possible role for a peaceful resolution. I'm not going into an introduction, a detailed introduction about him, but just to say that he now is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Birmingham. Another expert who's featured in various commentary. He gives commentaries, he's on news platforms talking about Tibet, the future expert on China's policies in Tibet and especially on ethnic conflicts. The third speaker would be Dr. Sering Topkia. I'm sorry, I've mixed this all up. I talked about Dr. Sering Topkia now, but let me go back to Kelsang Gyaltsen, who has been the special envoy for His Holiness Dalai Lama, and he is based out in Europe. He has been also in dialogue with the Chinese as part of the delegation which were negotiating the future of Tibet. He would be speaking, as I said, Sino-Tibet dialogue, and Dr. Topgyal will be speaking on shifting Asian geopolitics in Tibet. So without further ado, let me hand this over to Ambassador Kanwal Sibal to take us through this. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you for the honor you are doing to me to invite me to chair this fourth session of your organization. It's a very topical subject, but before I get into that, some housekeeping rules, because I've not done this before, and it's a 2.5 hours program. And as I understood that after each speaker, there will be a Q&A. And at the end of the speakers having made the interventions, there will be another round of discussions. But could you give me an idea, based on your past practice, how many minutes should each speaker be given to start with, and what should be the duration of the Q&A following each speaker, so that I have some success in time management?
I think about 20 minutes to each speaker, and followed by about a 10-minute Q&A. So we have some time at the end of it. We would like to, we've given 2.5 hours, but, depends on how far we're going. We could do it in 2 hours or 2.5 hours. I leave that to you, sir, as to how it goes.
Okay. Thank you very much. As you have rightly said, you got very well-qualified speakers for this evening. I looked at their biodata, and they are the right people to be called for us to have a better understanding of what the future prospects are of looking after the legitimate interests of Tibet and its people, in the light of the fact that China is continuing to strengthen its hold over Tibet and suppress the Tibetans further. You must have seen, as all of you must have seen, as I did, some reports on what Xi Jinping said the other day with regard to Tibet. And in a sense, this seems to be a prelude to further clamping down on Tibet's separate, distinct cultural and other identities, and impose Han supremacy on Tibet more and more. And the fact that he spelt out the new policy of fortifying Tibet, would suggest that the problem that we are facing in eastern Ladakh has been well planned and well thought out, and is part of this new strategy that Xi Jinping announced with regard to managing Tibet, which of course means that we are in for a long haul with regard to how to handle China in Tibet and in Ladakh. Unfortunately, Tibet, while being, to my mind, one of the most important issues which should have actually drawn the attention of the international community, of the big powers, on so many platforms. Of course, the simple platform of human rights and cultural rights. Denial of those to people who are evidently very distinct from the Han Chinese. And I'm leaving aside here the historical issues of Tibetan independence and how this was reflected in this treaty or that treaty. That narrative is there. But since His Holiness himself has given up the idea of Tibetan independence, and all he wants is genuine autonomy and genuine protection of Tibetans' cultural and religious identity. So the larger issue of Tibet's status can be set aside for the moment. The thing now is to see how, with China becoming more belligerent, more powerful, more confrontational, with its plans to become the leading part of the world in the next 3 decades, and timelines drawn on how it's going to achieve that through various stages. The Tibetan issue has to be looked at from the point of view of the rise of the policies of China. Along with that, of course, is the fact that the big powers, the United States and others, they have from the start neglected the Tibet issue. They have set it aside. They are not focused on it. India has unfortunately played a role in this by itself, not agitating the Tibet issue, and way back in 1954, handing over Tibet to China without any quid pro quo. And with India refusing to take a political lead in this regard, it is quite evident that no other country which is not as involved in the Tibetan question as we are, apart from the people of Tibet, would take the initiative to question China's policies in Tibet. And even on the issue of human rights, we've seen after the opening the US had towards China, slowly the Tibetan issue was relegated to the background. And for pro forma's sake, US leaders, when they visited China, would say that they raised the human rights issue, but it was largely the human rights issues relating to suppression of freedom of speech in China itself, rather than Tibet. Anyway, it's not for me to give you a longer lecture on these issues, because we have these very, very eminent experts. And I would like myself to be enlightened on why, for example, is Tibet important today. Now, see, the importance of Tibet is quite clear, even in the context of the water issue, which you mentioned, Krishan, because all the major rivers, virtually all the major rivers of Asia are flowing out of China, out of Tibet. And China has control over this, and it has had these grandiose plans of diverting the waters of the Tibetan rivers up north. And now, of course, they are having these run-of-the-river projects to produce electricity, and they have this humongous project, which I hope will never see the light of day, on the Brahmaputra's bend, the Shangri-La, which would be an engineering challenge, but China loves those challenges. So why is it important? Why is Tibet important today is an issue which interests all of us. So I invite the first speaker, Dr. Michael van Walt van Praag, to give his make his intervention for about 20 minutes. And at the end of 20 minutes, if he allows me, I will signal that the 20 minutes are over, and then we can have a 10 minutes Q&A. Over to you, Dr. Pran.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Sibal, and thank you to the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives for having invited us to this series of meetings, which indeed, as you mentioned, are very, not just informative, but I think they really give some, wait a minute.
I'm afraid we can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Oh, okay, yes.
Yes, and now you unmuted yourself. Please go ahead.
So I was thanking the Foundation for Nonviolent Alternatives for having organized these this series of meetings that give insight into various aspects, as Ambassador Sibal mentioned, of the situation of Tibet versus China and versus the international community. I've been asked to speak about the status of Tibet. And first of all, I would like to just ask the question why we need to speak about this question. And also, in light of the earlier remarks by Ambassador Sibal, I think it is important to just for a moment consider about why we need to speak about the status of Tibet. So in the first place, because 70 years of Chinese Communist Party and PRC propaganda have enormously impacted people's perception of Tibet's status at the time of its invasion. Today, many people, including foreign ministry officials who make policy and journalists who influence policy, assume that Tibet was part of Imperial China in some way. Even some of the younger generation of Tibetans in exile are not entirely sure anymore. We need to speak about the status of Tibet today to correct wrong assumptions and to take away any doubt anyone may have on this aspect of Tibet's history. This is critical should the kind of developments we're discussing today take place, such as the changes that are taking place in China today, the changes that some people are hoping will happen to the Chinese Communist Party, and any window of opportunity that might arise in terms of bringing about change to the situation in Tibet. Tibet's status is important because it directly affects the Tibetan people's rights, which Ambassador Sibal spoke about. It affects the legitimacy or non-legitimacy of Chinese rule in Tibet, the obligations of the People's Republic of China under international law, and the obligations of the international community, that is, all our governments, towards Tibet, the Tibetans, and towards the PRC. Therefore, to be clear on and to be vocal about the status of Tibet is critical for the Tibet movement's advocacy efforts, for the Central Tibetan Administration's diplomacy efforts. Whether or not there is a major change in China, there needs to be a renewed focus on the status of Tibet. And thirdly, we need to speak up about the status of Tibet because how the world's decision makers and influencers perceive the status of Tibet greatly affects the prospect of China's leaders today, or China's future leaders for that matter, of ever being motivated to resolve the Sino-Tibetan conflict on lines acceptable to the Tibetan people. So As the Dalai Lama himself stated in his 5-point peace plan in 1987, and repeated a couple of times since then, and I quote, "The real issue is the PRC's illegal occupation of Tibet." End of quote. This is not only the root cause of the ongoing Sino-Tibetan conflict, it's in fact its very essence. Human rights abuses, cultural and religious repression, and environmental mismanagement, of course, these need our urgent attention. But we should not lose sight of the fact that they are mere symptoms, which will not go away until the illegitimacy of Chinese rule in Tibet is squarely addressed. For a variety of reasons, the essence of the Sino-Tibetan conflict has all but disappeared from the discourse on Tibet, and in its place have appeared notions about Tibet's history that make us doubt whether the PRC's presence in Tibet is actually legal or illegal. We've started to wonder whether Tibet may have been part of China at some point in the past, and are entertaining the possibility that this gives the PRC the right to rule Tibet today. In fact, the PRC has been successful at changing the discourse in its own favor on the basis of historical claims that are difficult to assess, as they require extensive research on the basis of historical sources in various languages from centuries ago. And many people have started to doubt that it is as black and white as His Holiness the Dalai Lama's characterization of illegal occupation. They're trying to make sense of Beijing's masterfully crafted historical claims that fit nicely in a very Sino-centric rendition of Asian history that goes largely unchallenged. And they have difficulty finding solid evidence to prove that Beijing's claims misrepresent historical reality. And let's be clear, doubt is all that Beijing needs to maintain the status quo in Tibet. I can state with confidence that contrary to Beijing's claims, Tibet was historically, in fact, never a part of China. And this doesn't mean that Tibet was historically always an independent state in the modern sense of the term. Tibet had various relations with the Mongol, Manchu, and British empires, as we know, and sometimes those relationships involved dependency. But none of those relations entailed the incorporation of Tibet into China. In the time I have, I can't enter into the details on the specifics of the history, but my confidence comes from especially from the past 10 years of solid research that I undertook, as well as engagement during that time with about 100 scholars around the world, looking at Tibet and its relations with its neighbors, starting from the rise of the Mongols under Genghis Khan 8 centuries ago. And we chose that time because that is when Beijing claims that Tibet first became a part of China. My colleague, Mick Boltjes, and I systematically addressed all claims the PRC makes regarding China's alleged historical sovereignty over Tibet. We took them apart. We looked at the various aspects of those claims and found that none of them hold water. Tibet was not a part of China during the Mongol Empire, and it did not even become part of the Yuan dynasty at the time. It was not ruled by the Chinese Ming dynasty, and the Manchu Qing emperor's relations with the Dalai Lamas and Tibet never resulted in Tibet's incorporation into China. These conclusions are all corroborated in contemporaneous Tibetan, Mongol, Chinese sources, and other sources. And finally, the Republic of China, the first to actually claim Tibet to be a part of China, was entirely unable to establish any authority over Tibet, making its claim, contradicted by the facts of Tibetan independence at the time, completely empty. This analysis is contained in a new book that will be released in October. It's now with the publishers. That presents the Chinese claims and debunks them on the basis of both historical and legal analysis. And this is what the book is going to look like. Tibet Brief 2020 it's called. And in the Tibet Brief 2020, we demonstrate that Tibet today is an occupied country. The PRC's presence in Tibet is illegal because its armed invasion of Tibet in 1950-51 violated one of the most fundamental, in legal terminology, peremptory norms of modern international law. One that needs to be upheld by the international community par excellence, namely the prohibition of the use of force against another state. And since Tibet was not a part of China when the People's Liberation Army invaded it, and since under international law, a state cannot acquire sovereignty over another one or over a territory of another state, seized by force or threat of force, the PRC did not acquire sovereignty over Tibet by its invasion of Tibet. And this has consequences for the rights of the Tibetan people and as I mentioned earlier, for the legal obligations of all states, all members of the international community today. And that's also addressed in the book that will be coming out. And to summarize what those obligations are and what the rights are that come out of this analysis. In the first place, the Tibetan people have the right to exercise full self-determination under international law today. The PRC is required under international law first to end the occupation of Tibet and to allow the Tibetans to exercise their right to self-determination. And all of our governments have a duty not to recognize the illegal annexation of Tibet by China and not to cooperate or assist in any way in maintaining or assist in any way in helping Beijing to maintain or consolidate its unlawful rule of Tibet, or in Beijing's exploitation of Tibet's natural resources. Because these, under international law, belong solely to the Tibetan people. Now, many governments have violated the core rule of international law, which forbids states from recognizing the acquisition of territory by the use of force in regard to Tibet. And many of them also act in ways that help Beijing to consolidate its rule in Tibet, to deny the Tibetans the right to self-determination, or help them to exploit the country's resources or profit from Tibet's natural resources. All of these things violate international law. But having said that, legal obligations are not the only reason governments do well to course correct their policy on Tibet. Because besides legal and moral imperatives, it is the international community's own best interest to effectively address the Sino-Tibetan conflict. Not doing so, and looking the other way, as some do, has emboldened Beijing to assert expanding territorial claims and influence, something we're seeing in various places today. Beijing's reignited territorial claims in the South China Sea are an excellent example. China's very aggressive stance and action on the northern Indian borders and Bhutan is a very pertinent example. Its extortion of undue influence in Nepal and Mongolia, as well as its violations of Hong Kong's guaranteed autonomy which has a lot of attention in the press, its mass incarceration of Uyghurs, all of this cannot be treated as unrelated to the years of international appeasement of Beijing as concerns its unlawful seizure and occupation of Tibet and its implementation of oppressive policies there. Policies of integration and assimilation, and now, as the ambassador noted, an effort to fortify Tibet. As concerns India in particular, of course, as Ambassador Sibal pointed out, India's role is critical in relation to Tibet, more so than of any other country. And this will be discussed in some detail, obviously, later in the program of the Foundation for Non-Violent Alternatives. India has the same obligations as all other states in relation to Tibet. The obligations I mentioned earlier, not to recognize the illegal annexation of Tibet, not to do anything that helps the PRC consolidate its position there, gain recognition for it, or exploit the natural resources of Tibet. But India, unlike other states, except Mongolia, Nepal, and some other states, and Britain, of course, had treaty relations with Tibet, which recognized Tibet's or implied recognition of Tibet's independent status as a state. And not only that, India and Britain directly benefited from the treaties that they concluded with Tibet, and continue, as far as India is concerned, continue to benefit from the consequences of those treaty relations, which were confirmed by India upon India's independence. And so India has not only the obligation that I've discussed in relation to Tibet and China that other states have, but it actually has an obligation. It is not allowed to go back on its earlier recognition of Tibet's treaty-making capacity, therefore of Tibet's international personality, and therefore of Tibet's independence. This international law does not allow India to do. And because India plays such a critical role or should play a critical role in leading policy in relation to Tibet and China, it is also India which must be involved in any course correcting of policy towards Tibet today, when we are facing the consequences of a growingly powerful and assertive China, not just at the borders of India, but in many parts of Asia, and indeed across continents. Its influence is being felt. And so as the international community is starting to wake up to some realities of a new world in which China is asserting its power and its influence, it is a time for all governments that have expressed some interest and concern for Tibet and for Tibet's occupation, and again, especially for India, to reassess its policy on Tibet and to course correct, to take into account and to comply with the requirements of international law, but also political interests of those countries themselves and the international community at large. And those interests align with the interests of the Tibetan people. Because if they are developed in accordance with the requirements of international law, then they will reaffirm the rights of the Tibetans to determine their own destiny. They will be based on the independent status of Tibet and the illegitimacy, if you will, of China's rule in Tibet. These are all the reasons why it really is important to be clear about Tibet's legal status, past and present, both because it directly affects what should be the policy in relation to Tibet, but also because it gives those countries that have the courage to actually modify their policies real legitimate reasons for doing so. When we speak about, finally, the Tibetan policy, which we all know, middle way approach, His Holiness's preparedness and the Central Tibetan Administration's preparedness to forego complete independence, let us remember that this preparedness is only in exchange for the achievement of an agreement, a comprehensive agreement, that would satisfy the needs of the Tibetan people for a sufficient degree of guaranteed autonomy, as expressed in the proposals that the Tibetan side has presented and that are public. So it is, one should not consider that His Holiness or the Central Tibetan Administration, or the Tibetan people for that matter, have given up their right to a restoration of their independence or their right to determine their own political, economic, cultural, and other destiny. In other words, their right to self-determination today. They have expressed the preparedness to negotiate an agreement that could satisfy both sides, and that agreement could entail a relinquishment of the right to reassert their independence. So today, as of today, Tibetans have not given up their independence, and as of today, Tibetans continue to have the right to restoration of their independence and self-determination. Thank
You have made some very important points, very relevant points. The most important being that China never had a sovereign rule over Tibet, and its occupation of Tibet is illegal. I think from a purely loyalty point of view, from the legal point of view, what you say is right. But then from the practical point of view, we have then to see seriously whether the goal of Tibetan independence or compelling China to recognize that its occupation of Tibet is illegal will be a very uphill task. Let me ask you a couple of questions. One is that, some years ago, the British government said that it was a mistake on their part or something to the effect to recognize Chinese suzerainty over Tibet. Now, I don't know in what context this was made. It appeared to me at that time that it was intended to actually convey a message to China that we recognize your sovereignty over Tibet, and this concept of suzerainty that we developed at that time was a mistake, rather than the other way around, where the intention might have been to say that you had actually no legal right over Tibet at all. So I'd like you to give me your lawyer's point of view on that. Number two, you're right in saying that His Holiness's approach, the middle way that he has advocated, depends on getting a satisfactory agreement on recognition of the rights of the Tibetans. In other words, His Holiness is willing to give up the cause of independence of Egypt, of Tibet, on condition that the Tibetans have a genuine autonomy, but within China. So far, His Holiness has not resiled from the middle way. And so long as he doesn't resile from the middle way, middle path, and the conversations that have been going on, the negotiations that have been going on for some years have ended into an impasse, then what is the practical way out? If the middle path is not working, and it's clear it's not working, and the time seems to be on China's side, then at what stage should His Holiness actually admit that this middle way hasn't worked, and change his position? Related to that is the question whether he'd be willing to do that sitting in India and knowing what the government of India's formal position is ever since 1954, where repeatedly we have recognized Tibet in various ways to be a part of China. Although in the last few years, in our joint statements, we are no longer committing ourselves to a one China policy, which actually is more, I think, relating to Tibet than to Taiwan, because far more to us in every way is the Tibetan question than the Taiwanese question. So the abandonment of the formulation, accepting a one China policy may have a certain meaning, but we have not gone beyond that. And my own view has been, and I've expressed this in various ways, but though I understand the practical challenges that the government faces, is that the entire claim that China has on Indian territory, Arunachal Pradesh, Ladakh, Sikkim, wherever else, is based on its occupation of Tibet. And therefore, it doesn't make political sense, diplomatic sense, for India not to begin to question the occupation of Tibet by China. And one of the ideas that I suggested, but it hasn't taken traction, is that at some stage, government of India should openly say that time has come for China to have a serious dialogue with His Holiness the Dalai Lama to reach an understanding according to the wishes of the Tibetan people, because he represents the Tibetan people. And in the process, the issues between India and China will begin to find a way to a resolution. Just say that in order to underline the significance, importance of His Holiness, his representational nature, and the point that he has to be negotiated with. Anyway, the third thing which I think which we could do in order to start molding Indian public opinion is to have track 2 dialogues where we raise the kind of issues you have raised in a serious way, and then move it to a track 1.5 dialogue so that some of the basic issues that you have pointed at get discussed and become known. And the confusion that you have been speaking of in terms of Tibetan exiles in India, or whether actually historically China had ruled over Tibet or not, so that confusion begins to get addressed in a practical way. Anyway, these are some of the questions that I thought I would, as chairman, ask you to start off the discussion, and then we can invite others who I suppose know what they have to do. I think in the chat box or otherwise, or raise your hand or whatever the technical methods are, you could please ask the questions to Professor Prag. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Yes, I think you've, to a large degree, you've answered your first concern, which was to say that from a practical point of view, although legally I may be right in what I presented, from a practical point of view, that presents problems. Of course, you're right; it presents problems. Not addressing or not standing firm on the points that I mentioned presents bigger problems. In the first place, I think that the situation we're in today, and I don't have to remind you and everybody else in this meeting who is either in India or closely connected to India, of the dangers and the very critical situation that we're in today in relation to China and China's ambitions. We wouldn't be in that situation had a firm and principled position been taken on Tibet and on Tibet's illegal invasion from the start. And this is my point, not just that it should have been done from the start, but that it's necessary to correct the international community's policies towards China as early as possible. Because the more it gets delayed, the more appeasement continues in relation to Tibet, the bolder China feels, and will continue to feel, that it can get away with something once it creates a fait accompli. And that has been the reality. It gets away with things that it does once it establishes a reality on the ground. We see that happening in the South China Sea today, and let us not forget that the South China Sea arguments that China uses for claiming sovereignty in that region are very similar and are the same principle as the arguments it uses for its presence in Tibet. Obviously, as you stated, China's territorial claims in relation to India are all directly related to its claim to sovereignty over Tibet. If it had no sovereignty over Tibet historically, there is no claim to either the northeastern or the western sectors that it wishes to incorporate into the PRC. And so we can't see these issues as separate from the whole issue of the status of Tibet. And when I said that you'd answered that concern, I fully agree with you that there is a need for India, as there is for other countries, to at least make clear that they question the issue of China's legitimacy in Tibet, that they question China's claim to sovereignty over Tibet. And an abandonment of a one China policy is a step in that direction, and an important one. As I understand it, the one China policy was conceived specifically with Taiwan in mind, and in fact not Tibet in mind. It is the PRC that has started to use countries' acceptance of the one China policy in relation to Taiwan to say, because you've accepted that, now you cannot meet with Tibetan leaders, you cannot do this and that with a relation to Tibet, because you've accepted that Tibet's part of China. Those two things are in fact not related. Tibet has never claimed to be a government of China. The CTA does not say it represents China. The one China policy means that there are not two Chinas. There are not two governments of China, that you cannot recognize Taiwan and recognize the PRC, that you cannot have dealings with Taiwan and the PRC. But at the same time, the one China policy was developed by the US-China in its relations to make it possible to have separate relations with Taiwan that would not offend a recognition of the PRC as a legitimate government of China. So in fact, it is a license to have relations. If there is a connection with Tibet in the One China policy, and I don't think there is, but if there is, if China insists that the One China policy means that you recognize Tibet to be a part of the PRC, then it allows you to have separate relations with the CTA and with the Tibetans, just as the US is allowed to have separate relations with Taiwan, and other countries are as well. Trade relations, cultural relations, military relations are all allowed under the One China policy. So I think there's a big misunderstanding about the One China policy because China uses it at every turn to say, now you can't do this and you can't do that, and you can't meet with Tibetan representatives and so forth. The British statement was a remarkable statement in 2008, and you're completely right. I think I think your analysis of it is correct. It is absurd for the UK that has, as I mentioned, had treaty relations with Tibet, had extensive relations with Tibet for a considerable amount of time, and developed a policy in which it was prepared to recognize Chinese sovereignty over Tibet, and we're now talking about the Republican China period, that was prepared to recognize Chinese sovereignty over Tibet if China, on its turn, respected Tibet's full autonomy. That was the deal. That is what the British said and repeated again and again. Now, they were not always consistent, as we know. They moved in one direction and the other. But that is kind of the most consistent policy that they had, repeated again in 1943 very strongly and after that. And they maintained that, in effect, even after the PRC invasion. To now say, in 2008, and I agree with you that it was because it seemed to the government at the time an important thing to do in order to improve its relations with the PRC. They wanted certain economic deals in particular to go through. To then say that because the concept of suzerainty is an archaic concept from imperial days, that therefore the consequence would be that they recognize sovereignty of China over Tibet is completely illogical. If suzerainty is an imperial type of expansion of power, and you no longer think it's appropriate to recognize this kind of imperialist policy, then that means that you take away sovereignty and there remains nothing. It cannot suddenly have created sovereignty that has never been equated to suzerainty. Suzerainty and sovereignty are very distinct things. And as the British themselves made very clear to China in the past, their willingness to recognize suzerainty never implied a recognition of sovereignty. And they said this very explicitly and literally. So it is entirely wrong for them for the British to, if they question the concept of suzerainty as being relevant today, to replace that by sovereignty. I think Kelsang Gyaltsen, who will speak in a little bit, is much more qualified to speak about possible ways to respond to the fact that the efforts on the middle way approach have not been successful. And what should we do now? And what are the possibilities now? I would just like to say two things about it. In the first place, that I think the middle way approach signifies a willingness or a policy that entails dialogue, resolving the conflict non-violently through negotiations in a way that satisfies both parties. That is the essence of the middle way. That I cannot really see how that concept is something that would need to be changed. It is important to resolve the problem through nonviolent means and through negotiations at some point anyway. This is not just so for Tibet. It's actually a general principle of international relations. But the notion of the goal of genuine autonomy as part of a deal with China, I think one of the essential aspects of that, which is often ignored, is, and this autonomy that Tibetans have proposed is not just cultural and religious autonomy, it is political, territorial autonomy. I think we need to be clear on that. It's real autonomy, it is genuine autonomy. That can only work if there are some guarantees that it actually gets implemented. And I think that today, with what's happened in Hong Kong, with what's happening in Xinjiang, we are simply being reminded of something I think we have known all along. And Tibet's experience is the best example of that. That China's agreement to respect autonomy, as it did in the 1951 17-point agreement, is not worth the ink that, or the paper, I don't know what the expression is anymore, the ink that is written with or the paper that it's written on. When it's expedient for China to solidify its control, it will abandon the commitments it made to respect the autonomy, and is doing that today in Hong Kong. There's no reason to believe that this would in the future be different with respect to Tibet, unless there would be a regime change in China, unless you're speaking about a different kind of government and different kinds of leaders. I think that's, yeah, I've taken enough time to respond to your questions. I'm sorry. I think you're
Ask
muted.
a question on Mr. Yeshi's behalf, and then we can go on to the next speaker, which is this. Now the international community is no longer following policy of appeasement. What kind of course correction do you expect? This comes from Mr. Yeshi.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Yeshua. Well, I'm not sure what I expect, except for perhaps different posturing. What I think, and again, this goes to your point, Ambassador, I think that what should be done is, in light of the failure of the dialogue with China to bring about a solution to Tibet, to the Sino-Tibetan conflict, what governments, the best thing governments can do today is to reaffirm the rights of the Tibetans, reaffirm their position, and question, as I said, China's legitimacy for what it is, for its presence in Tibet and what it's doing in Tibet. And why I say this is that without that happening, there is no incentive for the PRC to negotiate with Tibetans. What China needs more than anything else from the Tibetan side is a legitimacy for something it has not been able to legitimize on its own. It knows that it has a serious legitimacy deficit in Tibet. And it continues with each policy and each new initiative. You see that they're trying to create a situation in Tibet where they will get more legitimacy from the Tibetan people, whether it's through economic policies or other policies. It is very sensitive about the issue, and we know that because at every occasion it requires governments in the international community to state and restate that Tibet is part of China. I don't know any other government in the world that about any of its territories presses the international community as hard as China does to recognize that that territory belongs to itself. So obviously this is an expression of insecurity, of doubt about whether there is recognition for this, whether they are legitimate there. So this is what the Chinese government needs and wants from His Holiness and from the Tibetans in general and from the CTA, is the legitimacy for its position in Tibet. It is willing to negotiate something in exchange for that. But if the international community is granting, without any quid pro quo, what China needs internationally, in other words, if the international community is saying, oh, your presence in Tibet is legitimate, then the Tibetans have no more leverage to negotiate. And there is nothing that the PRC needs to go to the Tibetans in order to get. And so we're undermining the possibility even of the middle way approach being successful. We're actively undermining it. And so I think what I would expect, or what I would hope the governments would do now, is to, as they are reconsidering their policies towards China on other issues, economic, military, and other, security in particular, that they reconsider this approach, which is undermining the possibility of Tibetans to actually negotiate with the Chinese, and realize that they must take a firmer stand on Tibet if China is to have an incentive to negotiate with Tibetans.
Thank you, Dr. Pragna. Let me go on to the next speaker, Mr. Kelsang Gyaltseng, who's going to speak about the Sino-Tibet dialogue and the way forward, and India's possible role for a peaceful resolution. Very important subject. I don't think, although I've had some private conversations with His Holiness about the dialogue some years ago. I met him a couple of years ago, or less than that, and spoke about Xi Jinping's China. And I personally gave him a very negative reading of this man, which with hindsight has proved true. Anyway, but all of us would be very interested in, Mr. Gyaltseng, what you have to say about the status of the dialogue, and especially India's possible role for a peaceful solution. So over to you.
Also express my sincere appreciation and gratitude to the organizers of this timely and very important discussion. Today, there is a unique window of opportunity for members of the international community to revise its past faint-hearted policy on the question of Tibet and to act in accordance with the principles of international law on the issue of Tibet. It has been said presently, we are witnessing a major global shift in the perception of and attitude towards China. Today, China is not seen only as a calamity for Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Chinese democracy activists, but also an eminent threat to freedom and democracy in the world. As a result, many governments are reviewing their relations with China and are in the process of reorienting their China policies. For us Tibetans, the most important China policy is that of India because of its direct impact on the outcome of the Sino-Tibetan conflict. India has a deeply venerated place in the hearts and minds of the Tibetan people, not primarily for political reasons, but because of deep and strong cultural and spiritual connections and bonding dating back for more than 1,000 years. This special relationship has been deepened and strengthened when His Holiness the Dalai Lama and around 80,000 Tibetan refugees found a safe refuge and a second home in India in 1959. Today, the exiled Tibetans are seen as one of the most successful refugee communities in the world, in terms of preserving their culture, language, and religion, national identity in exile. There is no doubt that this has been to a great extent the result of the tremendous generosity and hospitality accorded to the Tibetan refugee community by the people and government of India. However, on the political issue of Tibet, the government of India, up to this day, continues to be overcautious, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama once gently remarked. India's long-standing policy on the issue of Tibet has been to appease and to placate the Chinese government, starting in 1954 with the Panchshil Agreement, recognizing Tibet as a part of China. This approach toward China has been misguided and based on fallacies about the Chinese Communist regime. Consequently, in the light of the recent military clashes at the Indo-Tibetan border, there is the urgent need for India to re-evaluate and rethink its policy on China as well as on Tibet fundamentally. As many of you are aware, under the illegal occupation of Tibet, the Tibetan people are undergoing the most difficult and challenging time of their history. In fact, the struggle of the Tibetan people is not just a struggle for human rights and basic freedoms alone, but it is the struggle for the very survival as a people with its own distinct culture, language, religion, and its own civilization. The Chinese government views Tibetan Buddhism, Tibet's distinct culture, religion, and language and identity as a threat to the stability of its rule in Tibet. Consequently, for decades, China has been pursuing a policy of forced transformation and assimilation of Tibet into China's own image, a policy that amounts to a form of cultural genocide. Against this background, in late 1980s, during the era of reform opening in China under Deng Xiaoping, His Holiness the Dalai Lama formally presented his middle way approach concept in resolving the Sino-Tibetan conflict. The guiding principles of the middle way approach are non-violence, dialogue, and the pursuit of solutions of mutual acceptability and benefit. In the spirit of the middle way approach, the Tibetan leadership in exile have, for more than 3 decades, advanced proposals to solve the Sino-Tibetan conflict peacefully through negotiations. The Tibetan leadership took the courageous decision that such a solution need not entail the restoration of Tibet's independence, if a sufficient degree of true autonomy is guaranteed. In 2002, when direct contact with the Chinese leadership was re-established, the Tibetan leadership in exile had already formulated an agenda for our talks with the Chinese leadership. This agenda aims to seek genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people under a single administration within the framework of the Constitution of the PRC. I have had the honor of serving as one of the envoys of His Holiness, entrusted with the task of conducting the talks with our Chinese counterpart. With my senior colleague, the late Mr. Lodi Jari, and 3 senior Tibetan assistants, we engaged in 9 formal rounds of discussions and 1 informal meeting with our Chinese interlocutors from 2002 to January 2010. Right from the first round of the dialogue in 2002, we focused our energy and effort towards building confidence by dispelling misconceptions, misunderstanding, and distrust. Within our limited possibility, the Tibetan leadership in exile initiated a number of measures aimed at building a constructive and conducive environment for the dialogue process. by appealing, for example, to Tibetans in exile and to our international supporters to abstain from staging demonstrations during visits of Chinese dignitaries abroad. In our formal discussions, we propose a series of steps and initiatives in order to move the dialogue process forward and to make it more substantive. Among our proposals are the lifting of the ban of the possession of His Holiness Dalai Lama's photographs in Tibet, expanding our contact by arranging exchange visits by scholars and experts to academic, cultural, and religious institutions, the appointment of joint study groups to ascertain the ground reality in Tibet in order to move beyond each other's contention and to arrive at a common understanding of the real situation in Tibet. The release of a joint press statement after the widespread demonstrations throughout Tibet in 2008 to signal to Tibetans and the international community that Tibetan and Chinese leadership are determined to engage in discussions on all issues concerning the Tibetan people. A pilgrimage by His Holiness the Dalai Lama to China, enabling for the first time face-to-face meetings between His Holiness and members of the Chinese leadership since his visit to Beijing in 1954-55, etc. In 2008, in a direct and substantive effort to address the basic needs of the Tibetan people, we presented the Memorandum on Genuine Autonomy for the Tibetan people to the PRC leadership. This proposal described in detail how the exercise of self-government by the Tibetan people could be realized within the framework of the PRC constitution. To our deep disappointment, none of our suggestions and approach were entertained or accepted by the Chinese side, nor has the Chinese side reciprocated any of our confidence-building initiatives or presented their own suggestions or proposals for a way forward. Since the start of this dialogue, the Chinese side has been adopting a position of no recognition, no reciprocity, no commitment, and no concession and compromise. This clearly demonstrated the lack of political will on the part of the Chinese leadership to resolve the issue of Tibet peacefully through dialogue and negotiations. The last round of formal discussion took place in January 2010. Since then, all formal contacts between Dharamsala and Beijing came to an end. Now, the question is, what is the way forward? Today, when we look at the policies in Tibet, in Xinjiang or East Turkestan, and in Hong Kong, under the current Chinese leader Xi Jinping, it is clear that the primary objective of the CCP is to maintain complete hold on power and to fully integrate and assimilate Uyghurs, Mongolians, and Tibetans, as well as the people of Hong Kong in the process. Beijing does not hesitate to clamp down hard on any call for changes to its absolute control. National laws or even constitutional provisions do not provide citizens any protection from its arbitrariness. Against this background, it is hard to believe that the present PRC leadership will engage in negotiations to improve and increase Tibetan autonomy when all the evidence points to its effort to consolidate central control at the expense of regional autonomy or local decision-making. This is evident, among others, also in Beijing's determination to appoint reincarnated lamas, and especially a future Dalai Lama. These are policies to curtail and undermine, not uphold or improve autonomy, even in the cultural and religious spheres. Consequently, in my personal assessment, I do not see any possibility of reaching a common ground with the current PRC leadership until there is a new leadership in Beijing that embraces the spirit of openness, plurality, diversity, the principles of fairness and of fundamental rights and freedoms of the people. I believe there is no possibility to engage in any meaningful and honest dialogue with Beijing to resolve the conflict. Against this background, the task at hand for the Tibet movement, as well as for the members of the international community, is to press hard for fundamental changes in China. There is no other alternative to it. The international community must act with unity and firmness in exerting pressure on China to behave as a responsible stakeholder of the world community. China must be made to uphold the principles of international law and respect international norms and standards. This is the only way to ensure fair and rule-based international relations and to secure community and peaceful coexistence among the nations. In the case of Tibet, the core issue of the Sino-Tibetan conflict is the invasion and illegal occupation of Tibet. Under international law, as Michael has already outlined, governments have the legal obligation not to recognize the PRC's annexation of Tibet because it was illegal and by use of military force. What is of equal importance in this connection is the fact that the Tibetan people have never stopped to oppose and resist the illegal annexation of Tibet till to this day, by means of open revolts and uprisings and other forms of resistance, ranging from peaceful demonstrations to boycotts to drastic acts of political protest through self-immolation. Therefore, the international community has a legal obligation to seek an end to the occupation of Tibet and to enable the Tibetan people to freely exercise their right to self-determination. In this context, India's attitude towards China and its policy on China are of great importance and of far-reaching consequences. As the largest democracy in the world and a leading member of the international community, India's voice carries weight and influence. As an immediate neighbor of Tibet, India's position on Tibet is of great relevance and importance for members of the international community. During my time of active service, a number of European diplomats approached me to inquire about India's position on Tibet. They appeared to be somewhat surprised and confused as Indian officials and diplomats were close-lipped and reluctant to discuss Tibet. Obviously, India's position on Tibet is of importance for members of the international community. I have no doubt that many would follow the lead that India takes on Tibet. In the case of Tibet, as has been said, the illegal occupation and annexation of Tibet is the core issue. And in the case of India, the illegal Chinese presence in Tibet is an imminent threat to its national security and territorial integrity. These are facts. Against this background, the resetting of India's China policy must shed the fallacies about China that resulted in the current misguided policy. The reality is the question of Tibet is the key to securing peace at the Indo-Tibetan border. India now has the historic opportunity to face up to this reality with resolve, self-confidence, and foresight and to redefine its policy on Tibet accordingly. Thank you.
I don't want to again begin by asking you questions. I will later on, but I'd like to give an opportunity to some others who are listening in to pose their first question. I don't see anything in the chat box. Would somebody like to raise their hand? I still don't see anything. Okay, in that case, let me fill the void, as it were. First of all, when I met His Holiness a couple of years ago, he was very seriously considering going to China, and that's where he asked my view. And I'll be frank enough to say that I gave my thinking on Xi Jinping, and told him he was highly nationalist, and advised him against visiting China, in the sense that it will be an infructuous visit; it won't result in anything. But I could sense that there was a desire to go. Now, you said that the bilateral dialogue ended in 2010. So if a couple of years ago, there was this kind of thinking about His Holiness going there, and he actually explained to me some concerns he had. We'll leave that aside. So what was it that, what were the signals that he might have got from China at that time, that encouraged him to think that a visit by him would be useful? Secondly, can you shed some light about what China is doing in Nepal with regard to Tibetan refugees? Because they are tightening up, and Nepal is slipping into the Chinese camp more and more, which is a problem for us. The Tibetan question involved. Thirdly, this whole claim that China makes on Taiwan. And interestingly, they made a claim on a Bhutanese national park, which can only be accessed through Taiwan. It can't be directly accessed from Tibet. Do you think they are really very serious? Because one of the Dalai Lamas was born there, or is it just a ploy to put a condition which would make it impossible to move forward with the political parameters and guidelines that we discussed in 2000 and 2005? And lastly, you mentioned the policy of assimilation of Tibetans. Now, they've been hard at work at this. There have been significant economic progress, development, let's say, in Tibet, and the demographic changes and everything else. What is the extent of concerns that you might have that that there might now be a developing disconnect between His Holiness and the Sikh and the general Tibetan public in Tibet itself? And finally, in your talks with the Chinese, when you talked about Tibetan autonomy, genuine autonomy, was that limited to the Tibetan autonomy, TAR, or were you asking for a restitution of the old frontiers of Tibet? Please. A lot of questions, but there is.
Thank you, Ambassador Sipal. Let me answer your the last questions. I think, as I mentioned already, one single administration within the constitution of PRC, that means all the Tibetan areas should be merged into one administrative entity. And this is one of the non-negotiable positions that the Tibetan took in our talks with the Chinese counterpart. So this is one of our fundamental positions, that whatever we get through negotiations with Beijing, it has to cover and it has to affect and benefit all Tibetans. So that is one of our fundamental positions. Now, coming back to your first question, I think, first of all, we have to be aware that His Holiness the Dalai Lama personally is prepared to do anything he can in order to alleviate the sufferings of the Tibetans inside Tibet and to facilitate a resolution of the issue, Sino-Tibetan conflict. So in that context, I think also his middle way approach concept, that aiming for mutual acceptable solutions through dialogue and seeking a solution in the spirit of reconciliation. So in this spirit, in 2012, when Xi Jinping became the Secretary General of the CCP, and so not only His Holiness, but many Tibetans who are actually expert on China because they grew up in Tibet under the Chinese rule and speak Chinese and lived with Chinese. So many of Tibetan China specialists thought there might be a chance for Tibet because Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongshun, has been known among Tibetans as one of the very rare and few Chinese leaders who had some understanding and sympathy for the for minorities and especially for Tibetans. Xi Zhongshun was a very close friend of the late Panchen Lama, and actually Xi Zhongshun, Xi Jinping's father, had met His Holiness when His Holiness visited Beijing in 1954-55. So actually, when His Holiness emissaries in the 1980s, early 80s, went to Beijing, they were able to meet with Xi Zhongshun. And Xi Zhongshun showed to our delegates a photograph of, he had a photograph in his side pocket. This photograph showed him with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 54 or 55 in Beijing. And so therefore, against this background, many Tibetans thought, because of the history of Xi Jinping's father and Xi Jinping's father's thinking on minorities in Tibet, Xi Jinping would also pursue a different course of policy with regard to Tibet. And there were also some informations coming from Beijing that said Xi Jinping is very willing to do something on Tibet, to take some decisions or initiatives on the issue of Tibet. So in that overall atmosphere and context, I think also His Holiness may have had some hopes with regard to Xi Jinping. Now on I think concerning the Chinese policy of forced assimilation of Tibetans. Now it is difficult to tell what will be the consequences of this very strict and forced assimilation policy in Tibet in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. But looking back at the past 60 years, I mean, the China's policies with regard to Tibet has always been to undermine Tibetan language, Tibetan identity, Tibetan religion, Tibetan culture, and to assimilate Tibet. It's only differed in degrees of intensity with which the policy was pursued. So therefore, looking back at the past 60 years of Chinese rule in Tibet, all these policies of repressing Tibetan culture, Tibetan religion, Tibetan language, and especially trying to cut off the link between Tibetans inside Tibet and His Holiness the Dalai Lama outside, did not work at all. I would even say that the respect and veneration of Tibetans all over the Tibetan plateau today is greater. Respect for His Holiness the Dalai Lama is greater than it has been in 1959 before he left Tibet. So His Holiness has become also for the Tibetans inside Tibet a symbol of their longing for freedom, longing for dignity, and a symbol of the essence of their identity and culture and religion. So therefore, so far, it had the effect in increasing the admiration for His Holiness and the loyalty to His Holiness the Dalai Lama than undermining or weakening this link between Tibetans inside Tibet and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Now, on the question of Nepal and Tawang, I'm not an expert on these specific issues, but with regard to Nepal, obviously, you know, I mean, one of the principles that China always, you know, advances is non-interference in the internal affairs of a state and country. And you see in the case of Nepal, how China really, you know, interferes and in the internal affairs of a neighboring state, if the possibility is given to them, if there is no real resistance and opposition to it. So, of course, since some years, you know, Chinese direct influence in Nepal has growing, and that means more restrictions for the Tibetans in Nepal to gather themselves, to do anything concerning their own political issues or staging demonstration and so on. That is a clear sign of that China is exerting direct influence in Nepal. So on Taiwan also, I think, you know, the basic position, Taiwan also, the basic position of the Central Tibetan administration is, you know, we signed with British India the similar agreement in 1914, and we stand to this agreement. It was signed by the legitimate government of Tibet, and for us, this agreement is still binding. You know. I can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
Yeah, now I hear you.
No, there is a question which I think you've already answered, but I will. It's from Mr. Sergei Kuzmin. Is the Tibetan policy of the new CPC policy of Sinicization? How do you estimate future developments and results of this policy? I think you've already answered this question in terms of the effect of this policy of Sinicization in Tibet, that actually it is strengthening the image and the personality of His Holiness amongst the Tibetans. But if there's anything you want to add to this question, you may do so.
About the future, what are your forecasts? Thank you.
Yes, but the future development is also the policy in the future.
I think, you know, it's very, very, you know, difficult to foretell the future. But I think, you know, I see only two options concerning two options that could unfold in Tibet. Is one option is the more positive one. That is, you know, if there is a leadership in Beijing that is more open, as I mentioned in my introductory speech, is more open and more embracing concerning, you know, diversity and plurality of the state, then it might be possible to re-establish direct contact and dialogue, and to engage in some earnest and honest dialogue on the issue of Tibet, and which might lead to which might make it possible to reach a common ground. The other pessimistic option is there will be another round cycle of, you know, on the one hand, increased repression, and on the other hand, more radicalized resistance by the Tibetans. So the spiral of repression on the one hand, and resistance on the other hand, will continue. So which of the two options is more likely? It also depends on India, on other members of the international community. If the Chinese leadership in Beijing perceives it as more in their own interest, overall interest, to engage with the Tibetan side and to enter into a dialogue with the Tibetans, then the possibility that Chinese leadership will choose the option of dialogue, but dialogue is there. On the other hand, Tibetan willingness to dialogue with Beijing alone will not bring the Chinese side to the negotiation table. That, I think, is quite clear. So therefore, as Michael already mentioned, you know, what incentives can be provided by India and by other members of the international community, that is crucial, I think, how, you know, the future will unfold in Tibet?
There is one question which is interesting, which is that when you say that meaningful dialogue is possible only with a change in leadership in Beijing, what kind of change are you referring to? A generational change in communist leaders or a change that looks beyond the CPC?
Obviously, you know, some alternatives beyond the CCP might be most, might be much better, you know, for dialogue and for reaching some common understanding. But there can be also changes within the CCP. For example, if you look at in 1980, when Hu Yaobang was the Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party, he went to Tibet. He apologized in Tibet for the failed policies of the Communist Party in Tibet. And he even demanded that 80% of the Chinese cadres must be withdrawn from Tibet. And Tibetan should be administered by Tibetan cadres. So this clearly shows, you know, that even even the CCP can have a very tolerant and lenient and approach on minorities and toward Tibet. But if you look at the recent development, then I think so far, in my view, it is becoming more clearer and clearer that the overriding interest of the CCP is not the interest of the Chinese people or the interest of the Chinese nation and China, but the overriding interest of the CCP is to maintain power and control of China. And for that priority, the CCP is willing to do anything possible, and to also sacrifice, if need be, also that the larger interests of the people or of the country. So the hold to power is the primary objective of the CCP. And that, I think, this kind of thinking will prevent any solution to any enlightened policy towards minorities or towards Tibet.
Well, thank you, Mr. Galson. I think that was very, very interesting and useful. Let's go on now to the last speaker, Dr. Shing Topgyal. He will speak on shifting Asian geopolitics and Tibet. Over to you, Topgyal.
Okay, can you hear me properly?
Yes. Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers, particularly Rebon and Mr. Tandon for organizing the event and for inviting me. And I also would like to express my pleasure in obviously Ambassador Sipal and Mr. Verma, and also Michael and Kesang La, whom I have met in previous occasions. So my topic for today is the shifting Asian geopolitics and what it means for Tibet. So my core argument today is that in the emerging geopolitical competition, which has multiple facets to it, Tibetans will find both opportunities as well as significant risks that they need to be aware of and prepare for. In terms of the opportunities, Tibetans will need to be ready to escalate the demands, not just upon the Chinese, but also towards international partners or powers that seek to engage with the Tibetans and seek to use the Tibetans and the Tibet issue for their own interests vis-a-vis China. In terms of the main risks, like other East Asian or Asian countries, small to mid-sized countries, Tibetans will especially face three kinds of risks. One is of abandonment, and also the risk or the fear of entrapment in the interests, strategies, and conflicts of other players and powers, and also the associated risk of being exploited by others. So these are the three sort of risks that I will talk about. So the way I will go about today is first to sketch out very briefly what I mean by the geopolitical shifts in Asia, and then I will try to draw up some scenarios of how this geopolitical contestation will evolve into the future, especially in relation to Tibet and the Tibetans. And then I will go on to talk about a bit more about the opportunities and risks that I outlined, and then specifically go on to focus on what the Tibetans need to do to navigate through these scenarios, and also the opportunities and risks that I outlined. Because others have already talked about what other players like the Indians or the Americans or the international community should do. I will set that aside for the time being, and maybe we'll come back to these questions at a later point. So when I talk about the geopolitical shifts to this audience, I don't think I need to go into a lot of detail on this. Essentially, what we are seeing is a clear case of power transition taking place, especially because of the rise of China. So it is on the in the Asian theater mostly a competition between China and some of its allies, with a number of Asian countries as well as countries like the United States. So it is because of the rise in China's power, influence, and capabilities, it has a much wider set of issues, not just in Asia, but also around the world. So you have an expanded set of issues that China needs to protect. And with these expanded interests and greater capabilities, we see a China that is more ambitious, a China that is more confident and bolder, and will come into clashes of interests with a number of other players. Particularly, we're talking about the United States and its allies and countries like India. So it is, on the one hand, a story about U.S.-China relations and competition for the status of the most powerful country in the world and who is the hegemon in Asia. And then we also have the contestation between India and China, which are both simultaneously rising together and have a very short history of being neighbors, because Tibet played the role of buffer for much of the history until 1949. But short history, but with a very difficult shared history that we need to talk about, and a lot of clashes of interest, and not to talk about the perceptual dimension of the security dilemma between these two powers. And then obviously there is a lot of jostling between China and East Asian neighbors, many of which are closely allied to the United States or have strong security ties with the United States. And then we also, should not exclude Russia, although there is some kind of relationship of convenience that is targeted towards the United States and West. We should not discount the likelihood of relationship between China and Russia souring in the future for a number of reasons, both historical and contemporary, and disrupting the stability in the region. So what are the scenarios that we can think of in terms of how these competitions will evolve into, especially relevant to the Tibet issue? On the one hand, we can envisage a US-China rapprochement after this coming election, or after a few more years of contestation, and we can also think about the possibility of China and India going back to the past decades of trying to shelve issues like Tibet, or setting aside, compartmentalizing the issue of the boundary and border dispute, and then trying to engage in cooperation on other spheres. But I don't think, based on what has been going on in the last few years, and the postures and ambitions that emanate from Beijing, and also the resolve and desire of other countries to push back against China, that we will in the near future not go back to a period of rapprochement between the United States and China, or between India and China. The other likelihood is a period of warfare between great powers, and the fact that the Indian and Chinese soldiers are being deployed in great numbers along its border. Reminds us that it is not totally unlikely, but again, I think the great powers will manage to de-escalate the immediate mobilization and tension, and not let the situation and tension to evolve into an outright full-fledged warfare. So I think both these two scenarios are not that likely. So what we are left with is, I think, in my opinion, a protracted Cold War style of competition between two camps. One camp with the United States and much of the West, and the allies, and I might imagine India would fall in that camp. And some countries like Pakistan would obviously be allied with China, Russia maybe, and others, maybe smaller countries like Cambodia or Laos would be bandwagoning with the Chinese. So these are the three scenarios that can pan out in the future. And from my point of view, the most likely is a protracted competition, maybe not identical to the previous Cold War, but similar to a Cold War kind of confrontation for playing out for many decades. So what are the risks and opportunities that will present for the Tibetans? For dispossessed and occupied people like the Tibetans, maybe long periods of peace, stability, not the best situation for them. We can think about the number of countries that have emerged after the First World War, after the Second World War, after the end of the Cold War, that although we can anticipate ethical and moral questions around it, but from a purely realpolitik or rational interest point of view, people like the Tibetans might benefit from major systemic shifts and changes. And these opportunities and opening up of space is not entirely from geopolitical competitions and confrontations, but also from domestic changes that have always, particularly for the Tibetans, changes in China itself, political changes. So from the opportunities side, as I pointed out, in this new emerging environment, most countries will reassess the strategic and value, as well as in value of the of Tibet in various other areas. Obviously, India would have learned the lesson that Tibet is significant security interest or strategic value for India, and also in other dimensions. Many other countries would have learned that Tibet is not just an economically sort of barren or arid place, but a place full of water, as a resource, and various other types of natural resources, not to talk about the cultural and civilizational resources. So I think most countries would reassess, would assess the value of Tibet differently from when they calculated, the value of Tibet back in the 1940s or 50s. So on that basis, especially as this geopolitical confrontation and competition heats up and becomes more and more serious, more players will want to engage with the Tibetans, will want to use Tibet and the Tibetans in various ways. So it will open up space for Tibetans to escalate their demands upon them, and Tibetans should be ready to put those demands upon whether it's India or the US or other actors to, for example, do more for Tibetans in terms of not just giving asylum or refuge or economic forms of assistance or other symbolic forms of assistance, but also to do more concrete things. Whether it's expressing and manifesting in concrete terms greater support for in the legal and political forms that have also already been talked about. Whether it's stronger demands or support for Tibetan autonomy, if that is what the Tibetans want, or even when the situation becomes very sort of cataclysmic in the future, possibility of putting independence of Tibet on the table. So in terms of the risks, Tibetans are quite familiar with the risk of abandonment. Tibetans have had a history and experience of being used or being sort of abandoned, whether it's the CIA, projects or by the British. So we are not sort of totally unfamiliar with abandonment, and this is a risk that will go on into the future, and Tibetans will have to watch out for risk of being abandoned. Even in the last few years, you can see in the media coverage in the West, political discussions or public discourses in the conferences, in seminars, or in panel discussions, you see the Tibet issue disappearing. Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and other issues being always being mentioned, and Tibet has been sort of being left out, almost as if 160, just under 160 Tibetans did not self-immolate, in the recent years, or Tibetans are going through other types of suffering inside Tibet. So these are sort of different elements, manifestations of abandonment that Tibetans know about and will have to be prepared about. And entrapment, this is also or a situation that Taiwan has experienced and faced with. Japan, even Japan, has faced fears and dangers of, on the one hand, abandonment by the United States in its competition with China, and entrapment in U.S. competition with China on the other hand. It is also vice versa. America, feeling entrapped in Japanese sort of disputes with China, and there's other various similar types of situations. And Tibetans, because we have developed relationships with India, of course, with the US and various other actors, and as I was pointing out, more relationship will develop if the geopolitical competition heats up in the future. So entrapment is a risk that Tibetans need to watch out. And exploitation, again, is also an experience that Tibetans are not too entirely unfamiliar with, and Tibetans will need to be watchful on that front. So what should the Tibetans do? Coming to my final point, to understand which scenario they are in and how to navigate through these opportunities and risks. The biggest caveat is that Tibetans in exile are a small minority and always at the risk of becoming irrelevant. Most important to the future of Tibet and the Tibetans is the feeling and the activities of the Tibetans inside Tibet. So the Tibetans outside and other players who want to engage with the Tibetans and Tibet issue need to keep a close watch and pulse. Watch the pulse of the Tibetans inside Tibet. What are they feeling? What are they going to do vis-a-vis China and their policies? So the Tibetan exile establishment and other actors will need to find ways of engaging with the Tibetans inside Tibet. And this is especially important because China has done a lot of things in the last few years to cut off a relationship between the Tibetans inside and outside Tibet, and other actors in many ways. So that is very important. Other things are secondary but crucially important. One is reforming the exile institutions, the Central Tibetan Administration or the government in exile, or whatever term we use. At the moment, from my point of view, CTA has sort of had its use for the historical period, but I think it is won't be fit for purpose in the future for a number of reasons, because it is, in my sense, ridden by sort of factions and regional and sectarian kinds of allegiances. So the most important institution, which is the electoral institution, the way the Tibetan exiles elect their Sikyong, or the president and the parliamentary members, it is a highly sort of regional and sectarian exercise. So it deviates from serving the interest of the Tibetan nation as a whole. Although Tibetans claim to be of one national group called Tibetans, the way we go about our politics outside is similar to multi-ethnic societies in the Middle East or Africa, where different ethnicities and different national groups are competing with each other. And then reforming the exile institutions to maintain contact, a relationship with the Tibetan inside Tibet, but also to fit the purpose of the 21st century and after, because more and more Tibetans are going to Western countries. So how do we keep these, this huge diaspora together? And particularly the second and third generation of Tibetans born in North America or Europe or whose allegiances and identities will be challenged from multiple fronts. How to keep these huge flock, or if I can use that term, together for a common sort of national purpose is very important. And related to that is building the human resources. Obviously, human resources widely defined, but human resources for the purpose of navigating the challenges and opportunities of the geopolitical competition that I outlined above. And particularly useful for this is building the research and analysis capabilities of the Tibetans. I have in previous occasions suggested that more Tibetans should go into advanced degrees and try to join the Indian think tanks and do good work, research and analytical work in those think tanks, also in America or Europe or wherever we are located in, and also enhancing the strategic planning capabilities for the future that is coming towards us, and also stepping up the lobbying capabilities and activities to maintain existing relationships, but also build upon them for the purpose of the future, or whatever scenario we will find ourselves in the future. And based on the assessment of which scenario we find ourselves in, and also what are the sort of risks, set of risks, balance of risks and opportunities, Tibetans will need to be ready to review and change their positions, political positions, and political objectives and goals, whether it's autonomy or independence. Of course, on this topic, there's a lot more to say, but for the purpose of finishing on time, I will not go into the detail. So I will finish here and expect some questions. I can't hear you, Ambassador. Oh, yes.
What's happening? Hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
We can hear you.
We can hear others can hear you.
Okay, good. I don't have any question as yet for you, Mr. Topgyal. People perhaps are still cogitating what to ask you after your very useful presentation. But let me say a few things, and maybe that'll provoke somebody to ask you the relevant questions. One is that I think a lot of very good opportunities were missed in the past. For example, when the UN seat was given to the People's Republic of China, that was a great opportunity to do something for Tibet. But that opportunity was lost. The US lately, the present government, Trump government, is agitating the Tibetan issue more than before. But I don't think that this can actually push the Chinese in the direction that the Americans may want on Tibet, because the issues involved between the two countries go far, far, far beyond Tibet. The third is that Tibet, unfortunately, is landlocked. So the only access to Tibet is either through India or Nepal or Bhutan, but let's leave Nepal and Bhutan aside, is either through India or through China. So that also means that the interests of the international community in Tibet for geopolitical reasons and economic reasons will perforce be relatively limited. If, for example, for geopolitical reasons, there is a regime change in China, which the Trump government is hoping for. At least Pompeo is hoping for that. Then yes, opportunities can open up, but that is a much bigger issue. Also, the exploitation of Tibetan resources by third parties. Again, it's not possible because the only access to and from Tibet is through China in any realistic way. I think in terms of the future, if there is a political collapse of China, in the sense that the Communist Party is weakened, and we see in China what happened in the Soviet Union. In that scenario, since the Soviet Union broke up, China could potentially break up. But I think because the the Communist Party has resources far beyond what the Soviet Communist Party had. So I don't think that that scenario is likely. And also, the Chinese military is very strong. It's a different matter that the Soviet military was not used to protect the integrity of the Soviet Union, because Yeltsin himself was very keen to break up the Soviet Union. But there is, of course, a Chinese military in the PLA, which would ensure the territorial integrity of China, even if the political capacity of China gets weakened because of the weakening of the Communist Party. I think you're very right when you said that there is now great difficulty in getting into touch with the Tibetans inside, because Chinese have built such systems that they're monitoring everybody very closely. And any effort to contact anybody outside is immediately monitored and acted against. And I think people are finding difficulty to get intelligence on the ground. I'm speaking about our side. I don't know about the Tibetan administration, how they are managing this, and to what extent. And I'm sure conversations are going on between the Tibetan administration and our side about the feedback they're getting from inside. That is important to the point that you underlined. The final point, 2 points I'd like to make, is that China seems to have weathered the problems in Xinjiang, despite the pan-Islamic dimension of what is happening in Xinjiang, reasonably well, because in the UN Human Rights Commission, the key Islamic countries gave a clean sheet to China, surprisingly. So once they have weathered even a situation like Xinjiang, which potentially could complicate the relationship with a whole host of countries in the Islamic world, unfortunately for Tibet, that kind of potential, that kind of pressure that can be put on China seems to me to be difficult. And finally, I keep reading and rereading about what Mao Zedong said about Tibet. That is the palm of the hand, and there were 5 fingers, and that included a lot of countries around Tibet. So he was, in that sense, very forward-thinking, and immediately occupied Tibet, and now he's sitting on the water resources of Tibet. And from Tibet, he can put pressure, China can put pressure on a whole host of countries. So geopolitically, for China's own ambitions to be the leading power in Asia and keep everybody under their tutelage in different ways, Tibet plays a very significant role in terms of southern part of Asia. And of course, what they're doing in South China Sea is to control that space, where, of course, they're meeting the US challenge strongly. But on the land here, I don't think the US challenge is very meaningful. India has to bear the brunt of it and challenge it. Now, one question has come from Yeshi. Can you elaborate the kind of reform needed in CTA to make it relevant to the 21st century. Can you unmute yourself?
Oh, yes.
No, you're still muted.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Oh, yeah. First, if I can address some of your points, Ambassador, and then I will go back to the question on the chat box. I left it out, but I was going to say that when I was talking about the opportunities, I'm restraining myself from overstating the scale of these opportunities or even the likelihood of these opportunities. But the reason why I talked about it is that we especially prepared for what we think is unlikely or not going to happen. So which is why I talked a bit in detail about that. But so the reason why I even mentioned the possibility of these kind of opportunities is that up to now China was able to exploit an regional and international system that was that ranged from engagement to appeasement in many ways. So on a whole host of issues, whether it's trade, security issues, and territorial issues, and issues like Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and even Xinjiang. Most of the world, particularly the West, and I would also include India, were quite sort of by the economic opportunities that China was set to present, and also the sort of the liberal notion that engagement with China would change the Chinese political system, and all of these notions, and so China was able to get away with a lot of things on all these fronts. But now we are talking about a future where much of Asia and many countries in the West, and I would think India also feels that way, that this kind of policy or expectation and hope is not sustainable. So we are looking at a different future where the possibility of a Cold War style confrontation between two camps, and people in both United States and India and in other countries like Australia, Japan, and some countries in Europe are talking about sort of a democratic sort of alliance to push back against China. And I think many countries in East Asia, Southeast Asia particularly, because they are small countries, they don't have the size and scale and power on their own to do much about it, but to live with the reality of whether it's economic relations with China or security relations with the United States. But I think this kind of future that I'm talking about will push them into one camp or the other. So in this kind of future, I think it is possible for the Tibet issue to move out of the human rights or moral kind of issue that has been the mainstay in many countries to become a major strategic and geopolitical issue. We are talking about water and ecology, climate change as very important issues for the future, and control over who controls over Tibet, the Tibetan Plateau, will have significant implications for the future livelihood of billions of people in Asia. And also, although Tibet is landlocked, as you said, it was the route through which the United States, obviously the British, had a lot of influence and control over Tibet, and Americans also used Tibet as the route for sending supplies to the nationalist army, before the Second World War. So it is not entirely inaccessible, and it is not impossible that Tibet could have a strategic or geopolitical significance in the type of future that I'm talking about. Obviously, if we go by what the situation in the past few decades, obviously what you are saying is holds water. And then I'm also talking about political change within China, which can be as a result of not just the demands from Chinese people, but also as a result of pressure from geopolitical competition outside. I cannot hear you, Ambassador.
Is it?
I
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, no.
I interrupt you because we have only 6 minutes left. And
Okay.
and you had to answer the question on, I think you can forget what I said. Let's move on to the questions, which is the kind of reform of the needed in CTA, which is a big question. So let me see if you can compress your answer. And the second question, which I see on the chat box, which you could answer, is this. You base the shifting Asian geopolitics to rise of China and India. In what sense do you mean the rise of these countries? Do you mean in economic sense or beyond? And how do you also see the sustenance of this rise? Again, a very large question. So if you can spend 3 minutes answering these two questions, then I'll hand over the thing back to Mr. Krishan Verma. Please.
With regard to reforming the CTA, there are multiple answers to this question, but I think my main focus is on the political, legal, and institutional dimensions. So, particularly as I mentioned, the electoral system should be reformed because the type of institution that we are practicing today is, it's otherwise called consociational democracy, which is applied in failing countries like Lebanon, and European countries like Netherlands used it when they first entered the modern democratic system, but then they grew out of it as the institutions became stronger, and the social and norms, political culture changed. They changed to the current practice of full-scale democratic system. So I find the electoral system particularly problematic. Of course, it served its purpose in the past, but now because of the type of election that we are holding, and this relates to insights from democratization literature in many countries around the world. The combination of democratic institutions or rights, particularly the right to vote and freedom of speech, if you mix that with fragmented identities, then it is a poisonous environment which can fragment and have negative implications for governance and even government, and also the integrity of the nation and the state. So that needs to be reformed so that regional and sectarian considerations do not become the major concern. And there are cross-cutting allegiances, membership, and electoral system. With regard to the second question, obviously, I was not basing the shifting Asian geopolitics to just the rise of India and China. Obviously, it's the much bigger story of U.S.-China rivalry over hegemon, who is the hegemon in East Asia and the leading power in the world, but also Japan, China, East Asia versus China, also important dimension. But I isolated China and India because they are both rising powers. Although China has taken a big lead, they are both rising powers simultaneously. Just one rising power in a regional or global system is stabilizing enough. But if you have two rising powers in the same region with a difficult history, although it is a short history of being neighbors, with all these clashing issues such as the border issue and others, it becomes even more destabilizing, potentially destabilizing, if the leadership and multilateral institutions are not strong enough to manage the contestation. So that is what I was talking about. Obviously, the competition between China and India is much more than the border dispute. There's something of an arms race. For example, the nuclear weapons issue can be an illustration of that. But also there is a security dimension to the and defense dimension to the competition. There's also economic dimension to the competition. There is maritime dimension to the competition. There is diplomatic as well as trade competition in even as far as Africa, if we can, not just the South Asian neighborhood of India. So it is a multifaceted relationship and a form of competition between India and China, which I sort of identified as one of the dimensions of the geopolitical competition that we are walking into.
Thank you, Mr. Topia. I think we have reached the end of this session. It's already almost 4 o'clock. I would have liked to give an opportunity to the panelists, the other two panelists, to say a couple of words if they wanted to, but I think there are time constraints. So should I hand this thing back to you, Krishan?
Yeah, I take this. Thank you so much, Chair, for your great remarks, very insightful, and I think you did encourage tremendous amount of thoughts from the three speakers, which I think were very germane to this. I'm going to leave it with a question, which I should have asked earlier. I think it would be really Kelsang La who would answer, but anybody else could take it up, and maybe perhaps you could send it to us. Where there was constant repeat about India to take the lead about the Tibetan question. I wanted to put it a different way. How do you see with whether it's the Holiness Dalai Lama or the CTA, what would they do to help India to take the lead? Is there something that they can do? With China referring to Ladakh as Little Tibet, as they're talking about Arunachal as South Tibet, is there something that they could say to help India revisit this and look at this whole problem again and see how we could refashion our stance towards China? Leave this thought with you. I think we are running out of time, so I don't expect an answer now. So at the end, again, I would just say thank you very much, each of you, Ambassador Sybil, for taking the time out from your busy schedule and chairing this. To Professor Michael Van Walt, always a pleasure hearing you with great insights about the international law aspects of the Tibetan issue. To Gelson for also spending some time with us from Europe. It's always a pleasure to hear somebody who's actually been involved in the negotiations and dialogue with the Chinese. And of course, Shering Lau, who actually gave us a very good oversight about the geopolitics on the Tibet issue. Thank you very much, and let me leave this here. Please do join us for the next session. We will be sending out invites from behalf of the FNVA and my colleagues. Ribon as well as Professor Tandon. Thank you very much for joining us and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.